Welcome to Thrive and Shine HR, a podcast and video series dedicated to helping us overcome the limiting beliefs, self-doubt, and imposter syndrome that so many of us HR professionals face. Here are your hosts with over 45 years experience in HR and certified life coaches, Jen and Katherine.
Hello, viewers, listeners, Jen. Welcome back to Thrive and Shine HR. Here we are, Jen, episode 35.
Wow.
My in-laws are here. They're downstairs, and they were like, hold on, what are you doing? And I was like, I went upstairs to record our podcast. She's like, what are you talking about? So I'm so excited to be with you. I wouldn't miss this for the world.
So excited to be with you too. And 35 times we've come on and done this. And each time it always feels like we're uncovering more and new. It's just, barely scratching the surface.
Barely. Exactly. And I think there's so much to scratch in terms of the surface or unpack when it comes to today's topic, which is, of course, handling adversity like an HR pro. I love this topic so much. And I'm so curious, Jen, like it's Thursday at the time of this recording. So we're on the home stretch to Friday. And do you have any sense of how many instances of adversity that you've encountered this week alone?
Oh my gosh. It depends on like how deep you want to go in terms of the subtlety of the adversity, right? Because I think, adversity can come in so many different shapes and sizes. So when it comes to maybe, feeling left out in certain leadership conversations, or if it comes to challenges of conflict and dealing with conflict, or if it, so I think that, I don't know, a dozen, and a lot of it again is just not necessarily like in your face type of adversity. It's really about like, oh, that's interesting, and recognizing areas that, if I were to leave unchecked is not necessarily the end of the world by any means.
Right.
But it's where could I possibly have influence based on the fact that I can see that I am, outside of, where I may have had influence in the past. So so I think it comes up often, and I think it comes up more than many times we are aware of. I hate to give like this nuanced answer to the question, but it's really a matter of, being something that I think adversity is all around all the time. And how much are we paying attention? How much are we kind of aware of those potential adversities, and whether they are direct and conscious, or whether or not those are, behind the scenes and things that, we may not necessarily be aware of, or others are not necessarily aware of, that they are creating a sense of adversity. So how about you? What comes up for you around how much you have experienced adversity just this week alone?
First, I just have to back it up a little bit, because you, of course, just went so deep right off the bat. I love it. You're just like, this is my interpretation of what you just shared. Like, how much is conscious? How much is unconscious? How much is it what we're putting into the world? How much is it that others are bringing into our space? So I love it. Per usual, I'm like, let's go, Jen. For me, if I'm being really honest, and that's what this podcast is all about, right? It's all about our emotional, our physical, and our mental health, and being really honest so that other women in HR can understand that they're not alone, right? So for all of our listeners, all of our viewers today, this week's been a rough one for me. It's been a little rough because of some personal things that are going on in my life. And I love my in-laws so much. And we have had the most fun time since they've been here. And in some ways, it's just reminding me of other people in my life where there's a little bit of a rift. And it's just so ever present in my face right now. And I'm trying to shift my thoughts and do a lot of self-coaching. And I'd be lying if I said this week in particular wasn't filled with adversity. And I also know it's happening for me. I can't see it right now, but I know in due time it's going to reveal itself why this adversity was so important in my life. And I truly, truly mean that. And I believe that. And it just helps me keep moving forward. It truly has. So I'd be totally lying if I was like, zilch no adversity, when it's more like, it's been a lot. It's been a lot.
Yeah.
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 I'd be
Oh my
totally lying.
gosh. I I'm like, I'm not worthy, because I can very much relate to that. And I think that there are times in our lives where to just be able to say, you know what, right now, it's taken a lot out of me.
Oh, yeah.
And it's only so much to really be
Yeah.
able to show up and handle these different areas. And again, it's not necessarily like in your face, punch you in the face type of thing. It's all of
Right.
the little things that
Oh, yeah.
tend to add up where
Oh,
all of
yeah.
a sudden you're like, oh, I
Yeah.
can really feel this right now. And so what you just shared, I relate to that 110%, right? Is
Yeah.
really trying to be present and grateful and all of these things that we want to do each and every day. But then when we do, are really taking ownership and stock of the reality of
Yeah.
some of the heavy things that are just part of our reality right now, having some grace,
Uh,
having a little grace with that and being able to say, you know what, it's okay
yeah.
that it's heavy. It's a lot right now. And being able to then kind of navigate through it from that place where it's not from a self-judgment. It's not from it should be different. I should change this right away. Like I could go into, rabbit holes and, go down, whatever on each of those. But it's really
Yeah.
about like that awareness that you
Yeah.
have that hit me hard. Like chills came over me, but I was like, oh my gosh, how often do we just tend to kind of try to power through that versus just being able to take a moment and reflect and be able to say, you know what, this is just what is right now. So
Yeah.
thank you for that. That I needed to hear. It had no idea I needed that.
I don't know, Jen. I mean, you are not alone, right? I mean, none of
Yeah.
us are alone in this. And one thing we have talked about on the podcast is this podcast is not about toxic positivity. It's not about everything's good if you put on a shiny coat and a pink hat. It's not that way. I don't know where those ideas just came from. Shiny coats, pink hats, no idea. I mean, life is filled with dark and light. And
Mhm.
life is filled with good times and bad times. And that's exactly what today's topic is almost about when it comes to adversity. And adversity is just a fancy term for difficulties. So I want to
Mhm.
make sure our viewers, we're all clear on what we're talking about. And just kind of rolling into our very first question, Jen, you probably talked a little bit about this already, but what in your experience are some really common instances of adversity that you have faced on the regular throughout your entire 5-year career in HR because you're only 25 years old? No, I'm just kidding. Throughout your entire HR career, I mean, what are some common instances that you have faced throughout your?
Yeah. Such a good question. And we have talked about this in some respect on the podcast before, but it's really about like the being in the field of HR and then having others who you work with in the organizations that you're in that don't really have a level of respect. They don't have a level of really kind of taking that HR role seriously in the way that you know that you're capable of. Right, here I am. I've got an MBA, right? I
Yeah.
know who I am. I know what I bring, and yet on the almost on the daily, right? You're not included in decision making that could have an impact at a strategic level to our people, right? You're not included in conversations that really could have an impact. You're not included in projects or things that find their way. And
Oh,
ultimately
yeah.
those types of things, as much as you try not to take them personally and you know hey, we're all human, and not taking them personally is really difficult to do, especially when we recognize the long-term impact, the bigger picture impact that some of the decisions that my managers are making out there right now.
Yep. Yeah.
And knowing that they don't necessarily think of HR intuitively when it comes to thinking these things through, right? HR is still seen in so many different ways. And because historically that is really how it's been in so many different environments, and this one included, about being the admin, the paper pusher, blah, 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 whatever, whatever you want to call it. But it's really about not recognizing this other piece of the role that truly does have such a massive big picture impact. So I think that if anything, that's my biggest pet peeve around where I face adversity
Oof.
still after my
Yes.
24 years in HR.
Okay. I literally could like pluck you right out of this Zoom or StreamYard, I guess is the software we're using. I feel like we're on Zoom right now. And I could plop you into HR Empower Hour that we led 6.5 hours ago, because that what you just shared is literally what we talked about for the entire hour of coaching today. Because of all the people on the call, 75% were struggling with exactly what you just shared. So I want
Yeah.
our listeners to hear this. You are not alone.
Mm-hmm.
If you can relate to what Jen just shared, I know I can, right? It's that, I don't know if proverbial is the right word, but that seat at the table, knowing we can have such a larger impact if we have that seat, or if we're listened to. I mean, we can operate at such a high level, and sometimes we just feel like we're not quite there.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, I mean, yeah, I think that's just very, very common in our field. I really do. I
Yeah.
know very few HR women. I know they're out there, but I know very few HR women who say, I have a seat at the table. I am listened to every time I speak. I don't have to fight for certain benefits. I don't have to fight to be heard. I am always respect. I just don't hear that. I don't hear it.
Yeah. Well, what's fascinating too is like throughout my journey, and now that I can really like see it in a different way now that I'm back in HR after doing coaching, is
Yeah.
really where it would have taken my brain previously. These types of slights, right? These types of behaviors by others where I would have taken it personally. And I can feel it happening, that level of that sense of imposter syndrome starting to
Oh,
rise
yeah.
within me of oh, and it really is so critical for me now at this stage to be able to like catch it, to be aware of it, to recognize that it's naturally coming up. But in that previous version of Jen would have
Yeah.
totally gotten carried away in it,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Totally off on a wild ride about, not seeing myself as good enough, starting to question myself, question my worth, question whether or not I belong here, all of those things.
Yeah.
Whereas now I can really recognize that and be able to say, it's not about you. It's not about you.
Oh, yeah.
It's completely okay. And,
Yes.
what is within my control? And we'll get
Yeah.
into this a little bit more a little bit later, but really compartmentalizing that. And that is a superpower that I am
Superpower.
really working on now, right? Like
Oh, yeah.
even now. And so it's not something that I think I have perfected in any way, but something that I feel like what's so exciting in a way is to be able to like see it from a perspective that I never would have even a couple years ago. So pretty cool stuff.
Amen. Yeah. And just the impact, when you look at your entire HR career that you've had thus far, how far you've come in just those last few years, when you look at it from that mathematical standpoint, that statistical standpoint, and how far you've come in such a relatively short amount of time,
Mhm, mhm.
that is powerful.
Yeah.
And for all of our listeners, it takes work, and you can move that needle pretty quickly if you really practice the
Mhm.
skills that are required to overcome any resistance to adversity, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's wild.
Amen.
Amen. I when I started thinking about adversity, like over the course of my, I've been in HR since 97. Are you ready for my litany? And I want to go down my list, because I want our listeners to really, really hear this. And really, so I wrote down competing priorities, last minute requests, shifting
Mm.
priorities when it rains, it pours, just that overwhelm,
Mhm. Mhm.
trying to find work-life balance, trying to be assertive, striking that balance between the employees versus the organization, unsupportive bosses. I also put down, and trigger warning here, I put down deaths. I've been very
Mm.
open about how I experienced 5 close employees pass away in 5 years. That was an adversity for sure. My own anxiety disorder, changing laws, getting buy-in, getting turned down on things that I thought were really important, like a sabbatical program I wanted to bring in back after 2007, 2008, right? The Great Recession. I mean, it goes on and on. Striking the balance between providing really comprehensive health insurance coverage, right, for our employees, while really minimizing the financial impact. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So if you, as our listener, if you can really relate to any of those things, you're not alone. You're not alone. And those all fall under that bucket of adversity.
Yeah, they
Of the
sure do. Wow,
Yeah.
girl, you did your homework.
I mean, well, once I was like, okay, it's time for you to answer the questions you're putting together for the podcast, right? And it just came out of me, and I was like,
Wow, just
whoa,
flowed.
that's a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah.
And I too reflect back on when I approached HR with victim mentality. It was very much a woe is me. Look at all these things. I'm so overwhelmed. I'm so busy. And I know
Yeah.
that can be hard to hear because we don't like to think of ourselves as adopting that victimhood or that victim mentality. But if we're being really honest with ourselves and we're looking at adversity through that lens of a woe is me, I hate to say it, but I love to say it at the same time. It's a victim mentality. And we have to be honest with ourselves. And I suffered with it for a solid 24 years. So there's a different way to go about it, which is what I love. I love talking about it. And you already
Yeah.
started talking about it. So good. So good. I'm curious, Jen, if you can give like a super, super specific example of a time in the past when you didn't quite handle an adverse situation successfully in HR. And maybe it's personal, I don't know. But do you have a specific example? Did something come up for you very
Yeah.
specifically where you were like, that didn't quite work out the way I wanted it to?
Yeah, it did. And it definitely came down to, a lot of ego that in
Ooh,
retrospect I could totally see, and so
yeah.
there was a situation that came up years ago where I was really struggling with the concept of HR being, I mean, as much as we want to be able to create belonging within our workplaces and create inclusion and create all of these different environments where people feel welcomed in all the areas. Where I was really struggling is really that solid understanding of why that can never truly be when it comes to the field of HR and the role of HR. I mean, in the sense of that it's truly equitable, right? Right. There's always
Yeah.
going to be that gap around people who are just not going to feel comfortable to be truly fully themselves. I have no
Mhm.
control over that. And yet for years I tried heavily to control that. And that was ego,
Yeah.
right? There was a lot of ego around that, to think that, as part of not only me being, in a role of HR where I wanted to make a difference and all of these things, but I also deeply wanted to fit in. I deeply myself wanted to belong.
Yeah.
And yet I was getting all of that mixed up and confused to think that I could do it all. Truly thought I could do it all,
Oh, yeah.
right? And so I would go into environments, one workplace I remember in particular, where I really was trying to kind of create, this the stew of this perfect environment. And there was,
Mm.
another department that, we would work with pretty closely, our accounting finance department at the time. And there were a couple of gals in the department who, overall, in general, these were the type of gals that I could, totally relate to. Whenever I came in, we were talking about American Idol, and we were talking, just the different shows and the things that we watch. And I was a huge binge watcher at the time of all kinds of different things, right? Different reality shows and that
Heck
sort of
yeah.
thing. So we would have so much fun and different bits when we were talking about different things when I came over to the apartment. But then there were other times where it was obvious I wasn't welcome, or that there was, kind of some crosstalk, or there was, things that they were keeping, quiet, or just gossipy type of things, and it really started to impact me. I started to gain what you were referring to earlier, that victim mindset,
Mm.
without really being fully aware of it, right? I started to,
Mm.
and what I noticed in retrospect is, rather than do some self check, right? And recognize my own kind of mind drama that was really creating, my sense of lack of belonging. I
Mm.
instead then kind of shut down, and I just started to be more cold,
Oh,
more less engaging, right? I self-protected.
wow.
I went burp, 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 right, in terms of my armor. And in retrospect, it's really fascinating how I do that. And there are other areas of my life, personal as well, or personally and professionally, where I can see that that's a pattern for me. That when I start feeling a lack of belonging, it causes me to feel maybe less safe or comfortable or whatever. So I then shut down. And so I started to engage in behaviors that was noticeable, right? I wasn't coming around more. And when I did come around more, I was direct, I was cold, I was short, I was to the point, and I was out of there. And it was obvious. And so over the course of the next several months, they then developed a bit of a chip in their shoulder about me, understandably,
Mm.
right? And so this built up over a period of time where I finally ended up having a conversation with one of them, where it became like revealed to me that, they felt like I didn't like them.
Mm.
And so I finally realized that I then was just exasperating my own insecurities by then engaging in behaviors to just push away or deflect, or
Mm.
not then just be okay with what was, and recognize again that it wasn't personal, that it had really had nothing to do with me. And even if it did, who cares? And so I think that, it was a real lesson for me. It was one of those lessons that,
Mm.
even at the time, I don't think I fully realized it until many years later, where I said, "Oh, that was my ego. That was then me seeing myself as a victim, and here's how I responded, and here's how it impacted me and others." And so, from an adversity perspective, being in the roles that we're in HR, this is a part of it. And to try to become naive around that reality and try to manipulate or try to make it different because I really want to belong or I want to fit in, all of that ultimately just sabotaged me. It blew back in my face in such a prolific way. But in retrospect now, I'm so glad it happened the way that it did. I wouldn't change a thing, because what a profound lesson to learn in such a realistic and relatable way. So, what about you? What comes up for you?
Well, what's coming up for me right now is I'm wondering if you were in the call with me and my therapist earlier today. I kid you not. I mean, we were talking about my naivete, and just, there's so much that you just shared in terms of ego. And I love that you always are so willing to be so vulnerable to the millions of people who are listening to this podcast, right? I mean, truly, you just opened yourself up and you went, I mean, right to the heart of it. And I so appreciate that. And as you were sharing all of that, again, this happens all the time when we record this podcast. My brain just starts reflecting back on so many different scenarios that, I mean, the one that really just came up for me was my lack of approachability, quite honestly, through my entire career. My entire career. So for me, it was almost 100% of the time that people would come to my office door, knock, 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 and say, do you have a sec? Do you have a sec? And I know the words that came out of my mouth were, of course, come on in. But I did not want them to come in because I always overbooked myself. I was always doing something because that came from my ego and my narrative, my lifelong narrative that I'm not good enough. So I would always just be triple booked. And I did it to myself. Nobody put that amount of work on me but me. So I was literally creating adverse situation on top of adverse situation on top of adverse situation. So when someone, I mean, I remember specifically, this is probably about 10 years ago now. And this gentleman in the organization came, knocked on the door, and I knew he actually suffered with a mental illness. Okay. Not a mental health issue. He had a mental illness because he and I talked about, I mean, just all the things covered under ADA, all the things. And he came to my office and he knocked. And I was having one of those moments where I'm like, oh my God, I have 6 million things going on. He's like, do you have a second? And I knew that the way I showed up was not welcoming, but he persevered and he came in my office and he told me about racial slurs going on that I just have no tolerance for those types of things. And I was really beside myself that here's an employee. It's taken him a lot to come into my office, to knock on the door and say, hey, I need to talk to you about something. And there I was just swirling in my own shit of adversity. And thank God, you know, we had a bonding moment years earlier where he was like, I don't know. I mean, I'm making this narrative up in my head. We never actually talked about this, but he must have had some sort of story that, okay, but this is Kath. And I can see she's stressed out and this is really important. And I am going to come into her office. Do you know what I mean? Like, I wasn't warm. I wasn't welcoming because of the adversity I was creating in my own brain. So that for me was one specific example, but something that if I'm really honest with you and our listeners, that permeated my 9-to-5 HR experience because I just was constantly overwhelming myself and triple booking myself. Truly crazy. I did it to myself.
Wow. Yeah, but
And
you know what you said.
like, go ahead. What were you going to say?
No, what you said that resonated so heavily with me is like, you know, it's almost like that perception of adversity that then justifies how we then show up in the moment, right? I mean, in retrospect, you can recognize how you weren't your best self, but in the moment, there's almost like this you know, dialogue that's going on within the brain, because I can totally relate. I mean, what you just shared, I could share several examples that are similar to that, where in that moment there is like this dialogue around the adversity that we believe that we have, right? That perceived adversity.
Yes.
And then from that place, there's then like this, you know, here, you know, I'm going to die on this hill type of thing in terms of how then we feel like justified in that response in that moment. So, that hit really hard. And I relate to that. I bet you many of our listeners would relate to that as well.
Well, and speaking of our listeners, I just think about how I always just spew and have these little stories. And then Jen, you so articulately can bring it home, summarize what I've said, and drive the point home in a way that I can never do that. So thank you for
It just hit hard, so you're welcome, but I think sometimes it just helps for me to kind of then, say that back out in a way that's like, "Wow, that really hit, in the right place for me," and I bet it would for others as well.
yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, and well, let's flip it. Let's kind of, that was both of us shared examples of what was really unsuccessful, if you will. But now I'm curious, what does quote unquote handling adversity like an HR pro look like for you now that you're 20 plus years into your HR career? What does it look like for you? Oh, I can't wait for this one.
Well, I'm laughing because I'm like, I feel like I've been a broken record already, and we're only 30 minutes into the episode around don't take it personally, right? And I think that that is the biggest thing that I have learned that's been the biggest shift of all around adversity, because that's where we get caught, that's where we get pulled down the rabbit hole of
Mhm.
really believing as though we are some sort of unique and special case, as though then at that point we then have something we need to prove, and at the
Mhm.
end of the day that that's a perception, that's the running away of that we take from thinking that this is something that is a problem, that is
Mhm.
something that is bad. We make judgments about it, and then from that place we start to interpret as though it's okay to see ourselves in that victim way, and then whatever action or non-action, as my example was earlier, we take, we then justify it from that victim place. So I think pulling ourselves back from that and detaching from that sense of feeling as though it is about us, that it is personal in some
Mm.
way, is such a massive, massive superpower, I think, for me. And again, as I shared earlier, it's not perfect. It comes up still,
Yep.
in my job now, but it's also a matter of practicing when it does come up and being able to reflect post incident, post circumstance, whatever the situation is, to be able to say, okay, what was that about? Right? It's like, what was that about? Because if I recognize perhaps I might have been a little bit persnippety, if I recognize that I might have been a little short, if I didn't quite handle something the way that I know that I could have, because maybe I was making a story of thinking that, and somehow I was the victim. What do I need to own in that? And whether or not it means I got to go and make amends, and I got to talk to the individual and make it all right or not, it's really about doing that self inventory. And so I think that that's something that I have been working on more and more, and it's not perfect, but it is something that I feel proud about, because I recognize that you have to actually show up to do that work. Right? It's very easy post incident, post situation where I might have played that victim card to then just move on. It's over. Let's just move on and be done with it.
Yeah.
Versus the forcing myself down and saying, okay, again, what was that about?
Yeah.
and having the courage to hear the answer, and then recognize how I could, be better and do better in the future. So that's what comes up for me.
Uh,
How
I have the exact same answer. The exact same answer. And I have chosen as a consultant to do a lot of workplace investigations, a lot of mediations, a lot of employee relations, because oftentimes those are the things that people want shipped off for a variety of reasons. One, maybe there's not a lot of resources in the house. Two, they're usually high stakes and they're very emotionally charged. And
Mhm.
people in HR, just because of the way our brains are wired, we tend to operate from fear. And I have done a lot of work to stop operating from fear. I've done 10 times the amount of work on trying so hard to not take things personally. And let me tell, I mean, we've all done mediation. Well, maybe not all, but in my experience, mediations, like if you start taking things personally as the mediator,
Oh.
you are not doing your job. Same with investigations. I mean,
Mhm.
you really have to depersonalize. And if you get quote unquote triggered, which is just something I hear all the time, it's like just one of those super buzzy words right now. And you just have to know that things are not personal in those types of situations. And if somebody starts to get heated and they get very emotional, I think the power of the pause. And I know what I need to do to not only get calm, but to stay calm and to
Mhm.
stay in that state of homeostasis. And it happened yesterday. I was on a walk. I was on my quote unquote personal time. I was on my quote unquote lunch break, and I had a client call, and I was really close to getting home. Okay, really close to my house, and I was like, "Do I pick it up? Do I pick it up?" And I was like, "Of course you pick it up, right? She needs you. Of course you're going to pick it up." And she was really, really charged. She
Mm.
was the furthest from Thrival HR that you could possibly be.
Oh.
She was super spinny and had spun herself into a state of tears. You know, she was not okay.
Mm.
And as her coach, I started having thoughts of, oh my gosh, how did she get here? We've been coaching for a while. How is she in this spot? You know, I thought I've given her all these tools. And so I was starting to create a very adverse vibe, and I was making it about me. I was coming at it from ego. And I saw it
Ah.
pretty quickly. And I was
Yeah.
like, I'm almost back to my house. Give me 5 minutes. And I had to ground myself so that I could stay calm and help work her out of that super spinny downward spiral that she was in. You know, so I know that I have to be that way in my coaching profession, in my consulting profession, in the mediations, in the investigations, when I show up as a trainer.
Mhm.
It's just so important, just in those highly charged situations specifically. So I don't know where that just came from, but woo! Yeah, Jen, as usual, you're inspiring me for story hour.
That example though is another one that I think I can relate to many, many times, right? Is like having a situation where you've worked with someone, whether it's a leader at the organization you work at or a client or whatever it is, you've coached them, you've guided them, you've tried to
Yes.
provide them with the support around how they can address a situation, whether it's something that, they're trying to, feel confident about or, they're struggling with. And, there it is a week later, they come right back
Yes.
and they're spinning out again. And
Yes.
how quickly and how easily it can be to start then, turning inward about that
Oh, yeah.
and start saying, well, what did I do wrong? What did I miss?
Yes.
How did I miss this? What, how did I, and so like being able to like catch that quickly, girl, that's awesome
I
because
mean,
that is the work right there.
it's the work right there. Right there. And it also was helpful that there was spotty cell reception. I was like, okay, this is a sign. This is a way I call them whispers. I'm like, you got to get off this call because this is not going to be productive unless you're totally grounded. So funny.
Yeah. You're like,
Oh,
gotta call you, bitch.
totally, totally one of those. I've never actually done that, but it doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. What about in terms of your career trajectory? I mean, what role has adversity played when it comes to shaping the course of your career?
That's such a good question. And I sat with that one a little bit. And I think the
Ooh.
number one biggest thing that I can say that's helped me more than anything else when it comes to how I face adversity in my career is the openness to talk about it. So when you had said something
Mm.
earlier about, how open I've been and you too, but how open we've been to just be vulnerable
Uh-huh.
about some of the struggles and some of the challenges that we've had, it has been mind blowing how much progress I've been able to make in challenges with managers, challenging relationships, conflicts, when I have let down my armor and allowed myself to really be honest and open about my truth, because it's not always pretty. It's mostly
Mm.
messy, and yet the power of like the freedom and the safety and the comfort that others will get. And it's so interesting because I think so often we just don't really realize that after effect that comes through the process of being vulnerable and
Mm.
sharing our truth. But when we do, when we share those adversities that we've experienced in the past, how we've overcome, right? That process of storytelling, and I know that we've talked about this in the past, but that process of storytelling is
Mm.
so empowering to others. And it allows others to be able to like connect to us in a way that just me preaching, which is really how I spent my first 23 years in HR practically, was
Mm.
being a preacher. And then getting to the point that rather than preaching, just tell my story, right?
Whoa.
Just be willing to kind of share how I got to where I got, and then let them do what they want to do with what they feel is best for themselves. It's been really miraculous to see how
Mm.
that's shifted in so many different ways, and it's really about giving the voice sometimes to the voiceless, or to those who
Mm.
just don't know any other way. So, yeah, I think it really, I've got so many different examples I can bring up of just when I finally just said, yeah, me too. And here's what happened to me. And here
Yeah.
was my experience. And here's how I came through it. And the eyes that light up, the leaning in that happens of others. Like it's really, really wild to kind of
Yeah.
actually see that in action and see how others respond to it. And so I'm just going to keep doing it. It's fairly new for me. And here I am so far into my career, but I'm like, oh, I see now. I
Yeah.
see now. And so when it comes to adversity, which everybody faces in one way or another, but yet we all want to be strong, we all want to be brave. We all want
Mhm.
to, we want to carry that torch. And yet we don't really recognize that by letting that go a little bit and being open to the truth of our adversities in the past is really what truly is going to help others rise and climb and get out of whatever keeps them stuck. So yeah, I really find that to be a truly powerful path that I've been on over these past couple years, and I ain't stopping. I'm gonna
I
keep
ain't
on taking those
stopping.
steps.
Yeah. Just keep on going. I
Woo.
love that. How did it feel to say?
Good. Yeah, it's so funny because, I've really recognized that the more I have been able to let out and just truly be able to say, it's hard. It was really tough, but it was okay. And being able to just really share it from more of a just releasing and pulling off those layers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels pretty darn good.
Yeah.
And yet the lead up to that, right? The fear and the discomfort of that leading up to that, it's unlike anything else, right? And we all know it because we all can relate to that.
Mm.
And you asking that question was so perfect. It's like, what is that like on the other side? Like it's fucking amazing. Right? It's pretty amazing. And yet
Yes.
so few times in my life can I really say I was truly able to get over to the other side,
Mm.
because I would I would find every which way possible to have that armor come right back up as soon as possible. I don't want to really go that level to vulnerability. So, yeah,
Mm.
that was a long answer, but that felt really good. Thank you for letting me get that out.
I feel like you and I are sitting on a couch with some tea
I
and
wish.
we're just, yeah, I know, but just that connection. And it's just so nice to know that for me, I'm not alone because my journey's been very, very similar. And I think perhaps for some of our listeners who haven't been in the field as long as you and I have been in, sometimes you can't see the forest through the trees. You're in
Mm-hmm.
it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you've been in HR as long as you and I have been in it, it's just we know that over time you go through so many experiences that you just naturally develop that skill of resiliency, and you can get through anything because you've been through so much. And I think it's life, the longer you get to live, the more wisdom you have.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that. The other thing that I hear so often lately is we don't learn from our successes. We learn from our failures. We learn from that adversity. And
Yeah.
it's almost like I've reached this point now where I was going to say welcome it. In certain cases, I welcome it. I think when it's less emotional, I'm like, bring it on. It's a client who's like, hey, do you think you could carve out even more time? Because we've had another incident come up that we'd love your help with. We have another incident where we'd love your investigative skills or your mediation skills. And I'm like, yeah, bring it on. Right. I welcome those opportunities. I really do. But then when it's my personal life, probably not so much. I probably don't welcome those if I'm being totally honest. But for me, it's that adversity, that how it shaped my career is, if I'm being really honest with myself, when I think about specifically my career trajectory and going from one job to the next until I eventually took the leap in becoming a consultant and a coach, I left jobs with full on victim mentality. Oh, they shifted my role and I don't like this anymore, so I'm going to leave. And I ran from jobs and I ran from bosses.
Yeah.
Oh, I fought so hard to have a seat at the table, and here's more evidence that I don't have a seat at the table. I'm out. And that literally, those adverse situations,
Yeah.
I would run away. And it was finally when I left my last 9-to-5 role and decided to start working toward my coaching and consulting business, that's when everything really shifted. And that's when my energy shifted, I guess. And my outlook on HR, my approachability, all of it really started to shift. So I'm super, super grateful. Do not get me wrong, for that victim mentality, for the running from jobs, from bosses, from hard situations, because it did truly lead me to where I am today. I'm grateful for all of it. I really am. All of it. It's not easy. It's not easy.
No, but having that perspective when you can look back and recognize what those patterns were, right? It was pride. It was, these things that then caused you, rather than being able to address it and call it out and have those uncomfortable conversations. You're like, I'm outie.
I'm outie.
Right.
I'm outie.
And yet being able to look back on that and say, hey, I was just self-protecting, right? You were just kind of going through the motions based on what you knew and what felt easiest at that time.
Yeah.
Completely okay. And that then is something that then, as you've matured and grown, you can look back on that and go, oh, bless her heart. Right? She just didn't have it within her
Really?
yet. She didn't quite understand yet how she could have addressed that differently. And that could have potentially had a pretty powerful and positive outcome. Just wasn't there yet.
Not at all. And if
Yeah.
I'm being very honest with myself, when I think about EQ and emotional intelligence, my self-regulation, it wasn't there.
It wasn't there. I totally can relate to that. Yeah, I have instances of that too. Cause we talked about earlier in this year, I went to 20 different jobs over the, years that I've been in HR. I did the same exact thing as you did. I ran away instead of addressing my adversity. And same as you, I don't think I would have had the emotional capacity to be able to do what I could do now. And so at the end of the day, that was exactly what was meant to happen.
Totally.
What was supposed to happen, right? So
100%. 100%. And it's like you were saying earlier, when you're on the other side of it, it's just so freeing. you experience, it's like, oh, well, that's why that happened for me. And that's why I
Yeah.
took that direction.
Yeah.
And you make these little upticks and you get a little bit better every single time.
Hmm.
It's everything. Well,
Yeah.
I mean,
Absolutely.
kind of related to that, do you think that, I mean, we kind of talked about that skill of resiliency, which I think is super related to handling adversity. But do you think that handling adversity is something that you can develop a skill set around it and maybe even master, or is that more of an inherent trait? Do you think it's kind of nature versus nurture? Do you think some people are just born with an ability to handle adversity more so than others, or is it just more skill based? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it is more skill based. And I think yet we have been really programmed to believe that it is inherent. So it's one of those that I think is really, really interesting because for the most part, I think most people out there believe either that they are good at or not good at handling change and handling difficulty and handling adversity, right? And you and I both know that the reality is it's a mindset. And
Yeah.
the mindset really comes to how do I show up in the face of adversity in a way that's going to be appropriate and reasonable that can allow me to be my best self. And I think that that is something that just requires over time awareness. It requires kind of self inventory process, as we talked about a little bit earlier. It just requires that sense of not overthinking it by any means, but really just being thoughtful when faced with
Mm,
adversity, when faced with difficult situations, and being able to reflect back on it and recognize how my emotional humanness may
yeah.
have played in how I reacted to that adversity. Was I then recognizing that that perhaps put me into a victim mindset? Was it then causing me to think that it was all about me and, versus being able to say, hey, it's not, again, it's not personal. And how can I have an impact in this situation and not then start to make it about me and make meanings about me? And so I think that ultimately, how we perceive, how we react to, and how we ultimately respond to adversity not only can evolve over time, I think can continue to get better and better and better. And hey, there is no doubt about it that there are going to be times in our lives where the level of adversity, like you and I were talking about earlier, this is a tougher chapter in terms of the level of adversity I'm dealing with right now. And so we have to be patient
Yeah.
and kind to ourselves in those different chapters, but also recognizing that we do have the capacity to build our tolerance for adversity 100%.
100%. Absolutely.
Yep. So what about you? I just noticed on the video for anyone who's watching today, can you see my video?
You're frozen, but you're frozen
I'm
in a great way.
good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I'm having some video issues. Thankfully, on the sound for those listening are not having this impacted
Yeah,
at all.
your
But
audio is great. Your audio is great.
all right. Well, what about you? Like what are your thoughts about that? Is this something that you feel like we're born with, or do you feel like this is something that we can evolve and grow?
I mean, I think you and I are living, walking examples that it's 100% about a skill. And it's 0% about an inherent trait. Truly. There's a gentleman named Paul Stoltz, and he has developed something called the AQ. It's the adversity quotient. And when I was doing trainings for a client, I did an entire training on, do you resist adversity or do you actually harness adversity? Do you welcome it? Do you see every challenge, every bit of adversity as an opportunity? You really look forward to it. You welcome it. Or you look more like I was for the majority of my career and really resistant to it. Right.
Yeah.
Again, anytime someone came to my door, I was like, no more, no more, no more, no more. right? So that was me down here. And I have, it has not been linear whatsoever. Jen, just like you were saying, like peaks and valleys. I think
Mm-hmm.
one thing we want it to be this straight line. And we suddenly want to be this person who's like, well, yeah, I love challenges all the time. It's just not that way. And I think the related skill set is that skill of resiliency, and you do build it over time. And to me, it's the greatest news ever,
Mm-hmm.
because that's where we step into that empowered HR. And we're not victims. We're actually quite the opposite. We're victors, if you will.
Yeah.
And there's just nothing more, for me, more freeing and more peaceful all at the same time. And it's I don't know. I can't imagine HRing, and I'll use that as a verb. I can't imagine HRing in the way that I used to. I just can't imagine. It's just, I can't go back now that I understand how to develop that skill set for me, but everybody's different. And that's
Mm-hmm.
another beautiful thing. It's just a matter of experimentation and knowing what works for you in terms of really developing that skill of resiliency. At least that's what it is through my lens.
Yeah. Now, say again, the book by Paul Stoltz is what? The Adversity Quotient? Is that what it was?
Adversity quotient. The book that I
Yeah.
read, that's what he's known for, the adversity quotient.
Mm-hmm.
But the book I read, I do this every time. I forget the books that I read. It's something, it's with Eric Wiedemeyer, who was a famous blind mountain climber. And they teamed up and they wrote a book together. And it's something about harnessing adversity. I'll look it up and I'll make sure it's in the show notes because it's good.
Nice.
And it's a great
Nice.
read because it's, I mean, talk about somebody who has just, I don't want to say had to, but because he was blind, because he had this desire to quite literally climb mountains, literally and figuratively, talk about just welcoming adversity on so many different levels. It's a really, really great read.
Mm.
Really great read.
Nice. Very good. I love that. That is one that's been on my list for a little while. And every time you've brought it up, I'm like, gotta get to that one. That's so good.
I've listened to it a couple different times. I mean, he even
Okay.
talks about um, quitters, campers, and climbers. So a lot of analogies with the mountain guide lifestyle. And are you the person who quits ahead of time, who doesn't even get to camp, or are you somebody who kind of just sits around and camps and stokes the fire, or are you the person who's out there climbing, who's really, really, literally quite welcoming that adversity with every single step that you take when you're climbing a mountain, especially as a blind climber.
Mhm.
So there's all these statistics about how few, like the small percentage of humans, I think it's like 20% or something like that, are climbers. And for me, I am like on the wall and I just can't get off the wall because I have just found my stride and I know when I need to pause and take a breath to resume that climb, so to speak. It's a cool, talk about that feeling of aliveness that we're all pursuing. It's a pretty powerful endeavor.
Mm. I love it. Love
So
it.
good. So good. Well, Jen, as we're wrapping up with today's episode, what advice would you give to our listeners who feel like they're totally drowning in an adverse situation or two at work or even personally? What advice would you give to people?
Hmm. Gosh, that's such a good question. I think the biggest advice that I could give is just breathe. Is being able to just breathe and know that they're okay, because the level of adversity, as we talked about earlier, is going to vary at different times in our lives and in our careers. And when we can, you know, give ourselves a sense of, letting ourselves off the hook a little bit, so then we can just give ourselves a little space. There's
Hmm.
something so important about that 99% of the time for me in my past, I really struggle to do, right? The more stress, the more that is put on us, the more that we feel like we are, backed in a corner, the more we're going to push harder versus the opportunity to actually slow ourselves down for just a minute to be able to get a sense of what's really going on. Because again, like when it comes to adversity, sometimes if we are feeling the emotional triggers, going to that word again, but if we're
Yeah.
feeling the sense of whatever comes up for us because of the adversities that we're facing, it can be really hard to get real clear and really uh, kind of detaching ourselves from our own experience, right? Because
Mm.
if there's any sense of you know that mentality of personalization or victimization that's happening within that, it's not going to be until I take that step back and get a more clearer picture of what's happening. And I'm not going to do that unless I really force myself to take a pause. So yeah, that power of the pause, girl, that is so important and so powerful. And then from that place, it's about then being intentional around where I go next, right? What can I chew? What do I have control
Mm.
over? How can I be able to take that next step and have that next step be intentional instead of, and here's my truth, right? Is that, if I were in a place where I'm feeling a lot of adversity, that's when I find I'm scrolling more, or I'm procrastinating
Ooh.
more, or I'm not actually doing the things that I need to do because I've now checked out in some way. So for me, it used to be whatever drink I was going to get as soon as I, found myself out of work and just starting to numb myself away. So I think it's that consciousness around, okay, yes, you're in that chapter like you and I talked about. We're in a chapter where we are facing quite a lot of adversity. But then what am I doing about it? How am I engaging with
Mm.
it? And how am I addressing it? And how am I responding to it so that it ultimately is as productive as possible versus am I creating some additional destruction to go along with the adversity that's come up. So I think, the advice really is a lot of it comes down to give yourself a break and give yourself an opportunity to get clear around what's really going on and what you really have an impact to control versus thinking it's all out of control. That's it for me. And I see, for those watching, I still am frozen. So I just noticed on the screen how I look. If you are watching this or if you're listening to this, I highly encourage you to go on after like minute 55 of this episode because you're going to get a good laugh out of what you're hearing and what you're seeing in this episode. Who knows why this happened? And I so am sorry, but it's actually kind of hilarious. So all right. Well, Kathy, what about you as we wrap up? What advice do you have?
I think you had so many good nuggets in there. I had so many points I wanted to make, but what you just ended on is really beautiful in that you could look at your frozen frame, right? You could make that mean a certain thing. It could be, oh my gosh, this whole episode is terrible, right? But what
Right.
you just did, Jen, you brought levity. You brought laughter to it. And I find myself laughing so much more in life. And I think sometimes I smile all the time now
Yeah.
because I just have this lightness because things are funny to me now. They really are. I don't take things as seriously as I used to in terms of I don't know if I'm articulating this very well, but you just demonstrated without using your words in a very direct way of how how we can approach that. That's another thing that you just didn't mention, but you demonstrated that sometimes adverse situations, it's like, how big of a deal is this? What am I making it
Yeah.
mean?
How big of a deal
And
am I making it?
right,
Yes.
right. And you're like, let's actually check out Jen's face at some, I think that's really beautiful and that's really powerful. And I love hearing you laugh right now because I do think sometimes the quote unquote serious nature of our jobs, the potential litigation and the emotional situations that we handle in HR. I think when we can just take a breath and when we can kind of laugh at ourselves, that's pretty big. That's pretty big. So probably out of left field, but why not laugh a little bit more? Why not smile a little bit more? Right? What are we making it mean?
That is so, so good. I mean, and I ditto that so much in terms of the ability to see lightness more and more and more when it comes to adverse situations. Wow. Yes, absolutely. Because the more that you can flip around how you're going to perceive something and see that as a way of being able to kind of let it go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let go of this holding on to, that this is
Yes.
a problem, and instead just find something silly to pick out
Yeah.
and have a moment where it can become a little bit easier for everybody. That's awesome. I love that.
Totally. You're making me think of, is it going to matter in 5 minutes,
Yeah.
5 days, 5 hours? I got that backwards. 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 months, 5 years. And if the answer is no,
Let it
ah,
go.
let it go. Are we gonna like stream in what is that? What is that? Frozen?
Elsa and Anna. How do I know that? Well,
Yeah.
a little bit about Jen.
Just a little bit more to come next episode, episode 36. So Jen, thank you so much. As usual, so much gold in here. And thank you just to all of our listeners for joining us for another episode. We love, 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 love hearing your feedback during, before, after these episodes. So please, 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 throw us some love, give us some stars, give us some hearts, and please, please, if you think there's anyone in your life who could benefit from this episode, please share it. Please rate. Please do all the things. We have a mission to really, really help women in HR thrive and shine in HR. So we can't do it without you. So thank you for listening, Jen. Thank you for everything.
Oh,
And
thank you. Yeah, and if this topic really resonated with you out there, join, the Empowered Hour next Tuesday, the
oh,
22nd. What is it? 10 a.m. No, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m.
yeah,
Eastern, because this is going to be a topic that I bet you is going to go even deeper and even more,
oh yeah,
being able to really kind of find maybe some tools, right, that
yeah,
others can be able to use to help with how we show up in the face of adversity.
yeah. Jen, going back to last week, we do a little bit of an audit, sneak peek, do a little bit of a self-assessment when it comes to our AQ. So yeah, I'm
Love
super
it.
excited to be leading that one next week. So thanks, Jen. Thanks for the plug. That was pretty awesome.
Anytime and always.
All right. Well, Jen, thank you so much. And to all of our listeners out there, just remember every day is a great day to thrive and shine in HR. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.